Mary, let's talk about mistakes. Like, what's the number, like, give me like 2, 3, however many, that really jump out at you, that everybody makes, the mistake that they make.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many. A couple mistakes. Being a reporter is a mistake. Telling your story like you're a reporter and you're just reporting the things that happened, right? Like this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and then this, and then this, and then this, and then this. That is plot. But that's only one part of what makes up a story. There's also character, there's also theme, there's also all these other things. So just taking that role of I'm gonna tell you what happened without also sharing how you felt about it, what other people said, what the setting was. So just being a reporter doesn't create an emotional response in an audience. Probably the biggest mistake is that stories just aren't structured well as stories. You know, the interesting thing is, as Bo said, we've been telling stories since we have been, cavemen days. Stories kept us safe, and that's why we all paid attention when people came back from their hunts and they told us what happened, because it was a way for us to survive. So at some cellular DNA level, we resonate with a good story. And what's interesting is we all know when we hear a good story. We all know what that feeling is. Wow, that's, you're engaged, you're leaning forward, your palms are sweating, your heart's beating. You know when you're hearing a good story, but understanding why the story makes that happen for you is a whole area of learning, right? There's reasons why those things happen to us when we hear stories. When they're structured certain ways, we respond in certain ways. And so having these particular story elements in a particular order helps people to respond that way to your story. And you recognize it intuitively when you watch it. You know when you see a bad movie, and you know when you see a good movie, right? You just know intuitively. So what I encourage you to do is start paying attention to why. Why does one make you respond different than the other one? What were the things that were different, right? For instance, one of the key story elements is, Bo mentioned conflict, which is one of them. The other one is usually the main character, which if you're talking about a story that's your own personal story, is you. Usually at the very beginning of that story, that character is after something. They have a goal. They have something that they want to get, and it's a great desire. And the more life and death that desire is, the more we're invested in the story. So, people will tell stories and they won't think about them in terms of these particular story concepts, and they leave out these little things. And then when they're built back in, all of a sudden, it's very interesting. I will often be on a call with clients and they'll tell me their story. Like the process is you tell me your story, right? The mastermind clients call me up, we spend an hour, they tell me about their story, and then I basically repeat their story back to them. Those of you in the room that have gone through this, right? You repeat the story back with all these concepts in place and all the stuff that you don't need to talk about eliminated. And very often the other person, who it's their own story, starts to have an emotional response. They'll be like, oh my God, like I'm getting choked up hearing my own story, But it's because as soon as we recognize that structure of a story, there's something that we cellularly start resonating with. And it impacts people on an emotional level. And that's what you want to do with your stories, is hit people on an emotional level.
Great. Let me ask you one more before I let you go. So you sat in their seats, I guess 5 years ago, we're thinking, right? 5 years ago, and you didn't want to. No. You're like, I'm not doing any of it. What would be like the best advice, having been in their seats? What would be the best advice that you would give them? I know that's a tough one.
No, I know the answer.
Oh, okay.
I would have started telling my personal story much earlier. Because I told other stories, and I told stories around the part that I didn't really want people to know about me, right? And it was only when I actually dug into that story that I didn't want to tell people, that I didn't want them to know about me, that things really started to shift and change. So I would just encourage you, if there's if you're dancing around, And Joan is here this weekend, and I just have to say that, sometimes telling that story is difficult, and you can't tell it publicly until you have done the healing, as I'm sure Joan would tell you. But I had a safe environment to start telling it, right? you start with one person who feels safe, which was Joan, and then it became the mastermind group, which was safe, and I told it there. And then I started to tell it to, strangers I'd never see again in classes in Hollywood. And then I started to tell it, in venues where I really felt raw and vulnerable, but I had had all this practice where it had lost some of its emotional charge for me. And then that allowed me to actually share it with people that it's impacting. So that's the first piece of advice, is just get this down as fast as you can, because when you land on the right story and you are engaged with it yourself and you understand its meaning in your life and what it means for your business, and you start sharing it, crazy good things start happening. And we've seen it over and over again with the people we've worked with. Crazy good things start happening. So that would be my advice.
That's great. Thanks, Mary.